colleagues and friends. My name is George Gray Molina. I'm the Chief Economist and Head of Strategic Policy Engagement for UNDP. It's a great pleasure, a delight to have with us a distinguished panel of co-authors for a report on debt relief for green and inclusive recovery. I'll introduce them in a minute. We also have a distinguished panel of commentators, discussants, who I'll also introduce. I'd like to start with some words of motivation on why this issue is important for us at the UN and at UNDP, and try to go down the debt crisis rabbit hole for about a minute with you, if I may. About a year ago, as we entered this crisis, we knew that the debt burden was very large in developing and emerging economies, but weren't sure just how large it could get. Indeed, with data to December of 2019, developing and emerging economies owed $3.1 trillion in debt service out of a stock of $8 trillion. 1.1 trillion of those was in longer term debt, so with a maturity of more than 12 months. And close to 400 billion of those were in public and public guaranteed debt. So that's the size of the challenge coming into the crisis about a year ago. As the pandemic hit, economies closed, labor markets closed as well, and developing and emerging economies acted by expanding their spending and deferring taxes through fiscal means, but also in providing liquidity and guarantees running through monetary policy. We all know that the size of that effort was very uneven across the globe. When we look at the IMF data from January of this year, we see that advanced economies were able to provide 13% in fiscal support and another 12% percentage point in liquidity and guarantees to their economies. Emerging economies provided about 4% in fiscal stimulus and 3% in loans and guarantees. And low-income economies provided only 1.5% in fiscal support and almost nothing in loans and guarantees. So what we got out of this after months in the midst of a crisis was a rule of thumb, whatever it takes in advanced economies, but mostly whatever we've got in developing and emerging economies. Now, 12 months into the crisis, the debt burden has worsened and a decision tree has opened for most and multiple types of economies. Some have tapped into the DSSI relief program sponsored by the G20 for debt service suspension for the poorest 73 economies. Close to 40 of those economies received a deferral for bilateral debt payments worth about $5 billion up to date. Others tapped credit markets and concessional financing to borrow their way out of economic and debt distress. And a further set of countries are playing a wait and see game to see if they can grow themselves out of debt distress. Now, all of these economies now face a repeat of 2020 in debt terms. So we've got another $1.2 trillion in long-term debt that need to be paid this year, $450 billion in public and publicly guaranteed debt. Only now the conditions are dismal. The economies have imploded, labor markets have imploded as well. Indeed, the question that I pose myself is, why haven't more countries defaulted or requested debt restructuring until now? Only 7 countries have either defaulted or requested restructuring. Credit rating agencies have downgraded dozens of economies for multiple reasons, but some have been downgraded for simply asking for debt relief under the DSSI or the common framework of post-DSSI debt restructuring. So debt restructuring is done, of course, on the basis of credit worthiness rather than need or SDG gap or resources needed to feed people, lift people out of poverty or strengthen resilience. And that's a dilemma that we face. That's the structure of incentives that developing and emerging economies face. Now, beyond debt default, in our count at UNDP, close to 72 countries are debt vulnerable and will feel the full effects of prolonged debt overhang, thus crowding out important SDG policy space and investments. And while credit worthiness, of course, is a departure point, is the starting point for all of our discussion on debt relief, it is a pretty low threshold from a development perspective that needs to fund a big push on green, digital, and inclusive transitions. So that's my 2-minute summary of the debt crisis rabbit hole. I'm already exhausted by describing the problem, but I think, fortunately for you and me, I won't be providing the solution today because we have a wonderful panel to do just that. let me introduce our speakers and also our discussants, and then I'll tell you a little bit about the run of show today. So we have with us, delighted to welcome Shamshad Akhtar, renowned development economist and diplomat. She's been an ASG at the United Nations, also vice president for the World Bank, a practitioner's practitioner, if you will. We're also joined by the wonderful Professor Stephany Griffith-Jones, who is director at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue and emeritus professor at Columbia University. It's great to have her with us. And we're also joined by Professor Ulrich Volz, director of the Center for Sustainable Finance and a reader in economics at SOAS at the University of London. We'll have a presentation and it will be followed by discussants. And we have with us Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who is the UN ASG and UNDP Director of RBLAC in Latin America and the Caribbean. Wonderful to have you, Luis Felipe. We have with us Celine Morod, UNDP representative in Lebanon, who will tell us about how debt relief is undergoing in the midst of a multiple crisis since the Beirut blast 6 months ago. And also we'll welcome Raymond Gilpin, who's the chief economist for UNDP Africa. And of course, Raymond has just put out a very interesting debt report on the region, which we'll also be sharing in future webinars. Now, for the run of show, we'll have a presentation of the report for about 20 to 25 minutes. We'll have, I'll jump straight into our commentators, Luis Felipe, Raymond, Celine, and then we'll have a back and forth with the co-authors if needed, and we'll open it up then for question and answer to the audience. Given the size of the audience here and the participants, I think what we should do is we'll collect some of your questions through the chat box, please, and we'll read them as they come in. And then I'll provide a brief conclusion at 9:25. We'll try to wrap it up. I'll give the last word to Shamshad and all our colleagues. So with that, I would like to pass it over to Shamshad. Welcome to this event. We're delighted to have you here, and we're happy to be joined by all of your colleagues. Over to you, Shamshad.
Okay, George, thank you for that scene setter that you had out there. You covered a lot of ground there. And you principally also talked about the real topic that we have in front of us, which is not just looking at one dimension of the issues that we face, the debt relief, but also on how do you really stimulate a green and inclusive recovery, which is quite critical to salvage the SDG space. We will be 3 people presenting this, so we will divide our presentation in different parts. The core of our subject matter is really trying to bring out the integrated nature of the triple crisis that globally we face. It's an unprecedented crisis. We are facing with a health crisis, which has basically taken huge amount of fiscal resources for people and businesses. And then we have a debt distress of different magnitudes in different jurisdictions. And we have a climate crisis, which we think that this crisis is terrible, but the next crisis in waiting is the climate crisis. So with this, let me talk about the 3 core principles for debt relief, for green and inclusive recovery, which is what runs across our whole report and presentation. And you will see a graphic illustration on how we are looking at this reinforcing architecture of the debt restructuring, as well as trying to conserve resources that could go towards real development, and in this context, really sustainable development and Paris Agreement compliances. So I'll take more time on this slide because this is the heart of what we are discussing. We all know that G20 approved a debt service suspension initiative, It's been extended. It will again be extended if needed to ease the liquidity constraint. And it is basically directed at the low-income countries, 70 eligible countries. And you have already quoted that the take is not that large for a variety of reasons. So our submission to the G20 is that we really need a comprehensive and coordinated debt resolution architecture, because this debt surge that we have is not only a pre-COVID legacy, because most of the surge happened before the pre-COVID, but it's complicated us unwinding right now this debt crisis. But also the sovereign debt is projected to grow by 11% of GDP over to 2019 for the emerging market and middle income countries, 13% in Asia, and 5.2% in LICs, the low income countries. IMF, of course, has pointed out that pandemic has adversely impacted low-income countries' solvency and liquidity indicators. So the question is that we are going beyond the liquidity dimension. I think somebody needs to mute. I'm hearing an echo. Over half of the countries, the LICs are now assessed to be at high risk or in debt distress, according to the joint IMF World Bank Debt Sustainability Framework. Now, after HIPC, sub-Saharan African countries took advantage of the fiscal space. So public debt, of course, that had risen earlier was adjusted downwards to 35% of GDP in early 2010. It has, in 2009, now it then grew to 55% of GDP in mid-2010, and sub-Saharan Africa's public debt is now currently projected to increase to 65% of GDP by the end of 2020, and who knows what 2021 projections will hold for us. The largest increases are in oil exporting countries, and the combined effect of the revenue shortfall on that frontier and higher debt services are pushing up the debt service to revenue ratio from about 22% under pre-COVID projections to 27% under current projections. So based on the latest low-income country debt sustainability analysis, 11 sub-Saharan African countries are currently at high risk of debt distress, and 6 sub-Saharan African countries are in debt distress, while vulnerabilities have increased for countries with market excess, as investor appetite and issuance have not yet recovered for sub-Saharan Africa. The list is growing, and the list will grow. Debt relief should, from our viewpoint, offer rational treatment across creditor types, allow for debt forgiveness where debt vulnerabilities are compounded by steep economic contraction, where interest liabilities are absorbing anywhere from 30 to 70% of the revenues, and countries face double-digit fiscal deficit. So it's not just about debt service suspension. It's about a genuine coordinated approach and, of course, looking at country circumstances. Besides short-term demand for liquidity financing, which has been a preoccupation for DSSI, sovereigns opting to defer debt liabilities could face bulge in repayments, and you can see the blip if you do the projections, which could induce solvency crisis of a higher proportion that, if it turns out into systemic solvency crisis, will make it more complicated to rescue. Hence, debt relief, in our view, should go beyond transfer of debt from the near to medium term, as former merely shifts payments to later years on NPV neutral basis, which could elevate debt distress. And worries are that half of the sub-Saharan sovereigns already at risk or in debt distress in 2020 will move could move to credit negative as should a systemic sovereign crisis develop. And this is going to make market access more difficult since there are a number of countries there. Now, on the debt relief, one last point is very instructive IMF 2020 study, which found that a one-year standstill undoubtedly generates welfare gains for the sovereigns, resulting in consumption increases about 0.1 to 0.3%. To avoid default, the standstill also results in capital losses for creditors of between 9% and 27%, which is consistent with their reluctance to participate in these early operations. So standstills also generate a form of debt overhang, and thus the opportunity for a voluntary debt exchange complementing the standstill with haircuts could reduce creditors' losses and simultaneously increase welfare gains at the end of the day. So sequencing is very important, which has not been recognized. Of course, the devil lies in the details, and I will stop on this particular item now, but also talk about the second core principle, which is the involvement of both public and private creditors. It was only in November the G20 agreed on a common framework for debt treatments beyond the DSSI to address the high sovereign debt burdens beyond official creditors to private creditor debt deferment and relief. If effectively structured, comprehensive framework could raise the credit worthiness of borrowers post-restructuring. But frankly, the fundamentals in the way it's evolving are not really there. And we have a contention on that in our report. The third core principle that we have, and my colleagues will speak more to it, is that governments receiving debt relief need to commit to align their policies, budgets, and spending with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and Paris Agreement. And this is possible if we have an inclusive creditor approach towards debt restructuring so that we could collectively move towards facilitating countries meet their NDCs and net zero emission targets. And there is a lot of literature out there to point out in a very convincing manner that this can only be done if we can generate more liquidity by way of SDRs and other instruments. So I'm going to cover now my last point because I don't want to take more time, which is the G20 comprehensive framework for debt treatment. So referring to the three priorities in the slide, G20 and Paris Club introduced a coordinated debt restructuring process for DSSI countries facing challenging debt burden, and it called upon IIF, International Institute of Finance, for private sector involvement. And those of us who were studying this know that it really didn't have material impact. Now there is no explicit guarantee on mandate defined for private sector involvement. Hence, there is need for further reflection on how to streamline the process of private sector involvement. So comprehensive framework focus is on low-income countries, we know, but it needs to be extended to high-distress countries, including the middle-income countries, emerging market with unsustainable debt. In its present form, the priority is on maturity extension, while haircuts are reversed for exceptional cases. So eligible countries requesting for a common framework are concerned about the undesirable consequences, including the downgrade in credit and sovereign rating. G20 called for burden sharing among all creditors. It could turn out to be reasonable through bondholders settlements, but bondholders are concerned that they are not a part of the restructuring discussion, but they are being demanded debt relief. G20 framework resembles, of course, the Paris Club process. Debtors' requests for debt treatment on a voluntary basis seek for comparable treatment with other creditors. So restructuring envelope is determined, of course, by IMF, World Bank, debt sustainability analysis. And we all know there are lots of issues with the way computations are happening for the debt sustainability analysis. One, there is no harmonized approach. And second, of course, there is no forward-looking assessment of what can complicate the debt sustainability analysis. As a student of economics, I know that whatever you put in the model, you will get what comes out. And clearly, climate risk is not factored in, to talk of just one of the things. So who's going to package this? And this is my last point. I have several points, but I'm going to stop because I want Uli to bring in the architecture. So we think somebody will blow the whistle and we'll get it right. But if you study very carefully the cases, and since I'm sitting in Pakistan and watching this unfold very closely, that what's happening inadvertently is that the IMF is facilitating debt restructuring by offering liquidity through RCI, the credit, it's called it's a facility, a window for liquidity, or RFIs, and IMF's standby or other facilities. I mean, that's happening to Pakistan. Pakistan first said, well, my facilities that existed, we would need an expansion of that. Then Pakistan applied for RCI. So what we are doing is postponing the day of reckoning. And in addition, we know that IMF is examining the potential role that state contingent debt instruments can play in reducing the costliness and risk of sovereign debt restructuring. IMF has increased the limits to their emergency funding windows from 50% to 100% of a country's quota, and cumulative excess increased from 100 to 150%. So what happens? Your debt sustainability scenario is built by the multilaterals, IMFs, new windows, but also it's happening from the policy space that MDBs have created. Now, this can't go on forever. Of course, we can buy time, but we will perpetuate the crisis because for now, COVID liquidity shock in emerging market is behind, and 38 of the 45 emerging market sovereigns are at high and moderate risk given the cushion of financing, including market access and IF support. You already know the names of the country, so I will just skip that to say that the default concerns going forward, as George said, would be centered mostly from the insolvencies that will come rather than the liquidity risk, as my assessment now goes. The other slide that we have, and I'll just take 1 minute, is really that public debt, of course, we know is unsustainable, but there is a lot of effort that is needed to revive the growth scenario because public debt grows, you need the denominator to work, although some people are saying denominator is not a good indicator of the size of the debt. GDP is not really an adequate indicator, the latest paper of Oliver Brancher. So if not addressed, the debt crisis will hold back recoveries and undermine the development prospects of hundreds and millions of particularly the middle income and emerging market population in the global south. We have already covered the next slide, which was about sub-Saharan African debt, so I will skip the details on that. I'm going to stop here and let Uli take over some of the very interesting integrated dimensions that we believe need to be studied carefully. Which is, one of them is the climate action. And as I said, it is a very lethal crisis in waiting. And we all need to figure out mechanism to divert the funding into strengthening the climate resilience, mitigation, and adaptation improvements. Over to you all.
Thank you, Shamshad, and thanks to George and team for having us. So clearly we're not only having, as Shamshad said, a looming debt crisis in the global south, but we are already arguably in a terrible climate crisis. And this is affecting in particular developing and also emerging economies. And climate scientists have been very clear. We are now having about a decade left to take drastic action to bring down carbon emissions to avoid catastrophic global warming. And it's also clear that we need to scale up massively in mitigation, but also we need huge amounts of money that have to go into adaptation to increase climate resilience. And investment in adaptation and resilience is really particularly important for developing countries, many of which are highly climate vulnerable. So as much as possible, we really now need to use economic stimulus and recovery measures to strengthen resilience of our economies and try to do that in a way that it fosters a just transition. But of course, as George pointed out, the economic stimulus that has been available for many developing countries has been very, very small. In a number of research pieces, we have shown that climate vulnerability causes not only all kinds of cost in terms of human lives, but also it threatens macro, financial, and fiscal sustainability. In October, we released a new report on climate change and sovereign risk, where we showed that climate change raises the cost of capital of climate vulnerable countries and really threatens their debt sustainability. So countries that are already punished by the impacts of climate change, the physical impacts of climate change, have to pay a risk premium on their sovereign borrowing, which is deeply unfair, and of course makes it all the more difficult for them to invest in resilience. And it's of utmost importance that governments climate-proof their economies and also the public finances, because otherwise they may face a worsening spiral of debt vulnerability, climate vulnerability, and indeed feeding into unsustainable debt burdens. So there is a very strong economic and fiscal rationale for investing in adaptation and resilience and to climate-proof the economy. Here you have two charts from the report I just mentioned. The left one shows that there is a positive relationship between sovereign bond yields and measures of climate vulnerability. So more climate vulnerable countries have to pay higher interest on their debt. And on the right-hand side, you can see a negative relationship between sovereign bond yields and the measure of resilience. So clearly, when we talk about debt and debt sustainability, we need to also look at climate vulnerability. And this provides a very strong rationale for making sure that crisis responses are geared towards green recovery. But more broadly, there is a lot of economic sense in trying to stage green recovery. There has been quite a bit of empirical evidence that green projects can generate more employment and indeed deliver higher short-term returns for the money spent compared to conventional non-green fiscal stimulus. And the IMF's recent World Economic Outlook nicely shows that a green recovery is not only economically sensible, but it's also cheaper. So it creates a greater return in the short run, but also helps the longer term prospects for development and importantly, bring down future cost of climate impacts. But Of course, the sad truth is that countries that are mired in debt will not be able to invest in anything at all, be it green or any other stimulus. But we really need to make sure, and also, of course, with a view towards the Sustainable Development Agenda, that each and every country is in a position to invest in a green and socially just recovery. And for this, governments will need fiscal space. Otherwise, they will not be able to undertake the absolutely crucial investments in health and social spending and the green recovery that is needed. So we do need, we argue in our report, a new framework that will provide debt relief to those countries that need it, while ensuring that the relief is calibrated towards attacking the virus, protecting the vulnerable, and indeed staging a green and inclusive recovery. And I hand over to Stephany to present our proposal.
I think you're muted, Professor Griffith-Jones.
I'm sorry. So thank you, Uri, and I want to thank UNDP for hosting us and giving us the opportunity of presenting our ideas and our proposal. So I think the first point I would like to make very quickly is to say that the risk with debt crises, and I've studied many of them, is that there will be too little and too late debt relief. And that will have a very negative effect on development. And I think that is a lesson we should be really learning from history. And the need, therefore, as we present, to have a comprehensive plan that would help the countries that have unsustainable debt burdens, what economists call that are insolvent. And we think that they should be all the countries that have this problem. The second point I would like to make is that, as Uli just said, is that one of the attractions, I think, of our proposal is that we link the debt relief granted with helping fund COVID recovery and a structural transformation that will make these economies greener, more inclusive, but also more dynamic. And therefore, hopefully from the point of view of the creditors and the donors, they would have, and the multilaterals, they would have an incentive to provide this debt relief because they would know that the resources would be well used. And that may give some greater political traction with this kind of proposals, because there would be two advantages. One, provide the fiscal space for the countries and making the debt more sustainable, but at the same time, ensuring that the additional resources saved would be well spent. So we have a proposal with 3 pillars. The first 2 pillars are for the 2 countries, for the 2 categories of countries that have an unsustainable debt burden. So it refers to the countries that have an unsustainable debt burden, whether they are leaks or some middle-income countries. And we have a first pillar which gives comprehensive debt relief by public creditors, a second pillar which implies some private sector involvement, with creditors swapping their old debt with a haircut, that is with a debt reduction, for new green recovery bonds. And I will explain that in a minute. And then for those countries that are not heavily indebted, but that have liquidity crises, the third pillar would facilitate a green and inclusive recovery through debt swaps, but also through new money, SDG-aligned debt instruments or green bonds or some instruments of that kind. And we see maybe a progression, because those countries that get sufficient debt relief in the first stage may then progress to being able to access additional new money. So to give the details, if I may have the next slide, The first step is that we would need, of course, as is the current practice, to have a comprehensive debt sustainability assessment of all LICs and MICs in their public debt problem. We're looking now at public debt. This will be carried out by the fund and the bank, as is traditional, but we think it's very important for them to have inputs from other institutions, including the UN. They have to be based on realistic assumptions and take account of climate risks, which Uli described. And if the debt sustainability analysis asserts that the public debt of a country is unsustainable, of significant concern, the G20 should try and coordinate all bilateral and multilateral creditors about a debt restructuring. And the IMF should encourage countries to have a debt restructuring, which would also involve private creditors. I will now describe the first pillar, which refers to heavily indebted countries and the need for debt relief by public creditors. So we see comprehensive and significant debt relief to heavily indebted countries with unsustainable debt burdens, analogous to, but probably improving upon, what was done under HIPC and the MDRI model. HIPC relating to the bilateral, MDRI to the multilateral, and governments that would receive such debt relief would have to commit to align their policies and their budgets with the 2030 agenda of SDGs, and in particular with the Paris Agreement. In the case of multilateral institutions, because we want to protect them, because they're owned by all the countries in the world and they lend to the developing and emerging economies, their debt would only be restructured for IDA eligible countries. And to safeguard their preferred creditor status, these losses would have to be financed by bilateral contributions from donor governments or the proceedings of gold sales, or possibly even through the issuance of new SDRs. Now, Pillar 2 will be will build on the experience of HIPC and of course of the previous debt restructurings, like in Latin America under Brady. It shows that compulsory participation will be needed, not just from official creditors, but the private sector alike. Understandably, the public sector doesn't want to give debt relief, and part of that debt relief then to be used to pay in full the private creditors. So there has to be equality between creditors, the treatment of creditors. But up to now, we have heard radio silence from the private creditors. A lot of concern, they like to participate in meetings, but in fact, there is as yet no comprehensive offer of debt relief. So what we think is that if the debt sustainability analysis reveals problems, the fund should require the sovereign debt restructuring involving private creditors and encourage or ask debtor countries to seek commensurate proportional debt relief from private creditors. And the way it could work, and this is our proposal, that those private creditors who would give that level of haircut would have issued, instead of their old debt, new debt, which we call green recovery bonds, but that they would be guaranteed. Some kind of guarantee, and I'll explain that in a minute. And of course, the reduced debt service burden from this debt relief would be partially used for spending on a green and inclusive recovery. So in the next slide, we can see that we are trying to think of a mechanism that builds on the Brady type credit enhancement that was used to help resolve the debt crisis of Latin America in the 1980s, but adapted to current circumstances, in exchange for a commitment to dedicate the receipts into SDG-linked spending items. So the idea is that an institution like the World Bank or IDA would issue bonds and use them as partial or total credit enhancement of the new bonds that the private creditors would get. And therefore, the new bonds, of course, would be less good for the private creditors because they've had a haircut, they've suffered, if you like, a reduction, but they would have the guarantee of a multilateral development bank. So that would make it more attractive to the private creditors, as well as making them accept it. And of course, it would help countries to later, hopefully, regain access to international capital markets. And this happened actually with the Brady bonds. Latin America returned actually surprisingly quickly to the capital markets in the very late 80s and early 90s. If I can, and the third pillar is for those countries that do not have major solvency debt problems, but who have, of course, environmental needs. And those countries that are not heavily indebted, but of course also have their fiscal space reduced by COVID, you could use the mechanism of debt swaps, debt for nature swaps that would encourage some debt reductions linked to increased debt servicing in domestic currency to be spent on investment in climate adaptation or mitigation. But they would be on a voluntary basis, and it wouldn't imply a distressed debt exchange. And it could also be complemented by measures possibly including some guarantees, some credit enhancement, to also the issuing of new money, because we think for this group it's also very important to ensure that they have access, renewed access to new lending, both from the private and the public sector. And with this, I would like to finish that all these three pillars would be linked, as was mentioned before, to aligning the policies and the budgets with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement, and that this would be monitored by an interinstitutional steering committee. And I think that this should involve public and private creditors. I think the UN should have an important role, and in specific cases also the UNDP at the country level, because you have these wonderful country offices, as well as both civil society representatives and national parliaments of debtor countries. I think often national parliaments are forgotten and there's only emphasis on NGOs and civil societies, but I think parliaments, when they are democratically elected, can play a very important role. So thank you very much for your attention. And I very much look forward to the comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Griffith-Jones. Thank you, Dr. Akhtar. Thank you, Professor Volz. I think it was a fantastic, succinct presentation. I encourage all of everyone who's on this call to take a look at the report, which is online at the Boston University link that we included in this invitation. Before we move over to our distinguished commentators, I just wanted to apologize to Dr. Akhtar. I downgraded her, speaking of credit agencies, from USG to ASG. And of course, she was USG for ESCOP, Executive Secretary. So with that note, I would like to pass it over to a real live ASG, my colleague and friend, Luis Felipe Lopez Calva, who is the UNDP Director of RBLAC, for his comments. Over to you, Luis Felipe.
Thank you, George. And I really want to thank Shamshad, Ulrich, and Professor Griffith-Jones for the great presentation. I watched a few months ago another presentation where I saw Prime Minister Gordon Brown give a brilliant speech. So it's a bit intimidating to go over the same choreography, but it is really, really an honor to be part of this meeting. First, I have 5 minutes, so I want to try to make good use of the time. So I can spend a lot of time telling you how much I endorse and agree with the main principles of this proposal. But I would like to rather talk about three elements that I consider could eventually be problematic, and in our conversations about this proposal, particularly at national level and also with other development partners, and to try to see whether it could be a way to go around this, and also an opportunity in this direction that we have been part of recently. So the first issue, of course, I mean, it's very difficult not to talk about debt without mentioning the term moral hazard. So the first point is, I'm talking about middle-income countries, and particularly countries in my region, Latin America and the Caribbean, that all of them have tax collection as percentage of GDP that is under OECD averages, certainly, and some of them actually quite low. So the first element that could come up in the conversation is when we talk about the sustainability, and this comes up all the time, as Professor Griffith-Jones mentioned, when the bank or the IMF does the sustainability analysis, the issue is also about revenue. So the question is, for countries, it would be very difficult at this point in time with the crisis to think about major fiscal reforms, but perhaps they could commit to a credible fiscal plan that would, not now, but sometime down the road, perhaps when you get a certain level of GDP growth, some of these new taxing elements could kick in. So maybe that could accompany this to make it more feasible and to address the potential critique in terms of moral hazard, because this will be for sure an issue. The second has to do with governance aspects in terms of some of the sectors that will be involved in terms of the investments that will have to be made to move into the more, into the alignment with the SDGs, certainly require institutional reforms. I'm talking about the energy sectors. I'm talking about some elements related to open access resources and so on, whose governance elements are not easy to solve and require a lot of political consensus and coalitions at the local level. So governments have been, and we have been, as UNDP, trying to work with governments in the appropriation of the SDG agenda at the national and local levels. And we have moved a long way in that direction. But still, we need to make sure that some of the institutional elements that are required for this to move in that, for national plans to move in that direction will have to be made. And then it has to be discussed that it's not simply to reconsider, for example, budgeting. We have been working very closely with governments to align budgeting to SDGs. And trust me, it's not an easy discussion always when you talk about sovereign parliaments and Congress, that is at the end, these are the instances that approve budgets and plans, and of course where many interests are represented. So that agenda is not as easy as that. And politically, I would argue, while we fully, as I said, embrace these principles, there is unfortunately, recently in my region at least, a political discourse in some countries that actually would be opposed to the idea that you have to align the budget because it is what international creditors are asking for. There is a little of a sovereign, neo-nationalist discourse that could make it a little bit complicated on the political side. I'm not saying this is an unsurmountable obstacle, but something we have to take into account. And the third one, and it's more a positive and optimistic comment, is that in a way, at the margin at least, the market is somehow moving in that direction, the direction that you are proposing, because I think the market for sustainable bonds and even for sustainable sovereign debt, even though it's still very small, is growing. And we're looking at investors that are already, because this is about basically changing the composition of a portfolio to investments that have a different time horizon in terms of their returns, but also for investors that are more interested in social and environmental dividends. So just to close, I would tell you that we recently accompanied the Mexican government as UNDP in the issuing of a sovereign bond, which is formally without guarantees, is strictly a sovereign bond, the first one in its nature, fully aligned to the SDGs. So we worked with the investment bank to structure the bond, and we accompanied the government with to face investors in the roadshow to ask, to answer questions of investors. We issued what we call an alignment letter for the use of the proceeds, and then we will be also issuing an opinion on the impact report that will be submitted to investors. So in a way, I would argue the idea will be how to make this new market grow faster. In a way, that is the market-driven way to make part of this proposal feasible. So I would argue this is an opportunity to speed up the development of that new market that is still very, very primitive, but potentially could be large. That would be my comment, George. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Luis Felipe. I would like to now give the floor to my colleague and friend as well, Celine Moirod, UNDP Res Rep from Beirut, Lebanon. Celine, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's going to be even harder to follow in those footsteps, so let me try from the perspective of Beirut. First, to say it's actually interesting, to be brought into these conversations, because I think our day-to-day has been mostly focused on responding to crisis. So, we sometimes have a very short-term view of what needs to be done, while obviously the solutions are long-term in nature. So I think it's always a good thing to kind of take a step and try to also look to the future. So thank you for this. So maybe just a few points. Obviously, me, I'm in the country, so I can't necessarily speak from a region or for a global perspective. So maybe I wanted to highlight a few things. First, I think, my colleague and I went through your report, and I think we all appreciate, and recognize the importance of, COVID-19 recovery presenting a unique opportunity to build back, to big forward, and to put all countries, I think, on a better path. I think it's important to recognize that, yes, I mean, COVID-19 has been an accelerator, but many countries, including, middle-income countries and high middle-income countries, including the one I'm living in, struggled before COVID, to create fiscal space for green and inclusive development pathway. It's not a new thing. It has been just accelerated by COVID. And then I think, we really endorse and like the idea, of a comprehensive new debt relief initiative that go beyond, debt suspension. If you look at Lebanon, I mean, I think we have a bit, there's no unique cases, but it's a bit of a different context, let's say, where we have on the one hand, a high middle income country that is in acute debt distress, but is facing a very compounded crisis. I think, everybody has heard about the Beirut explosion, but I think this is just the kind of one of the many crises that this country is facing. We are hosting the highest ratio of refugees in the world, as linked to the Syria crisis. We have had, an institutional and political fragility, I think, that has resulted in not a lot of investment in long-term development. And obviously, COVID is putting further pressure on our context. Right now, since 2019, we have a spiraling economic, financial, and fiscal monetary crisis, 150% inflation in 2020. And I think we are one of the highest ratios in terms of debt to GDP. So just to say, it's not an easy context. And at the same time, we're in a context where we have a government that has resigned in August. So also in terms of thinking about moving forward with, a plan, a policy, a negotiation, it also makes it all the more complicated. So I think, if we look at your proposal and at our report, I mean, we believe, that based on all the indicators and the situation that we face, we would in many ways be a very good candidate for the proposed debt relief initiative because, revenues which are diminishing and really reducing the ability of government to respond to health, social, environmental, and economic challenges. And, Lebanon being a high middle income country, we have now 55% of the population in living in poverty, which is double the average from last year. At the same time, and I just wanted to highlight maybe pick up on some of the things that was said before. Given that we have a lot of uncertainties around government formation and also the Lebanon's ability to initiate reforms, because there's been a conversation around reforms for the last 3 years, it's maybe very unlikely that Lebanon could secure the type of financing that is being envisaged through your report. There were conversations with the IMF that started a year and a half ago that were put on hold because the type of major economic change and reforms that are being requested are not really moving forward. So on the one hand, I think we present a good case, and at the same time, I just wanted to highlight a few issues. I think it's very important to speak to the governance, I think, aspect. I mean, in Lebanon, it's not just fixing the economy, it's actually looking at a lot of governance package that needs to come alongside, discussions around debt and fiscal reforms. And in Lebanon, it's mostly around issues around institutions, around anti-corruption, accountability, and transparency. I think I very much like your emphasis on aligning, any type of support with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement. I think it's very important because I think in certain contexts it needs to be re-emphasized and it needs to be clarified. What we have done in Lebanon here, and we've used the climate promise that UNDP has been supporting in a number of countries to actually make the case for climate proofing. So we've actually looked at the last 3 plans that the government has developed: a capital investment plan that was approved in 2018, the financial recovery plan that was developed last year, and a new economic vision for the country, and actually looked at whether it's climate proofed, whether the right investment are there in terms of mitigation, in terms of adaptations, so that we can make the case that as the situation improves at the country, as we have counterparts that we can work with, we can make an economic argument that the future, hopefully a recovery plan for Lebanon will be, as you are arguing, green. So, I think it requires data, it requires to make an economic case, and it requires to raise the awareness, because environment, unfortunately, in a number of countries where we work, continues to be seen as a sector, but not necessarily the foundations of a sustainable development. So I would leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Celine, for your insight. Let me move quickly to Raymond Gilpin, Chief Economist for the UNDP Regional Bureau for Africa. Raymond, over to you.
Thank you very much, George. Let me start by congratulating the authors on a very, very, very impactful paper. One of the benefits of being the last speaker is that I could be brief because we've already had a lot of input from everyone. But let me just highlight 3 things that stood out to me from the presentations on the paper, and then contextualize 3 recommendations from an African perspective. 3 things that stood out that are not usually in the debt relief, debt forgiveness, debt service suspension discourse. I think it was Shamshad Akhtar who mentioned this. The importance of sequencing in this context. We don't really think about a package of interventions that would address the issue, and we look at them in isolation. So sequencing needs to be on the table. Ulrich Volz mentioned the importance of a risk premium on climate investment. I think this is somewhere that particularly the multilateral community could be very impactful in garnering support to defray some of the costs that countries like African countries face in trying to climate-proof their economies through investment. And the third point, Stephany Griffith-Jones talked about the importance of a comprehensive approach. And this, unfortunately, while it is sorely needed, is the most difficult to do. Because if you look at in Africa, for instance, the composition of creditors has evolved tremendously over the last decade and a half. We've gone from the proportion that is private debt has increased from 9% in 2000 to over 17% by 2017, and it is growing. And so the moral suasion the leeway for moral suasion that multilateral and bilateral creditors had in the past is diminishing. In addressing the stock issues when it comes to debt forgiveness, yes, we need to shift our focus from liquidity and start thinking a lot more about how we address the solvency issue. But in Africa, external debt is not just a financial, fiscal, or credit issue. It's a development issue. Even if we wiped off all the debts, got to zero today, looking ahead, Africa's infrastructure gap every year is between 68 and 108 billion US dollar equivalent. Over the next 10 years, the gap for digital transformation between 80 and 100 billion. Energy gap between 40 and 63 billion, and I can go on. The importance of this is when we're thinking about a comprehensive approach to the stock and the solvency issue, looking back is helpful, but looking forward requires us to be a little bit more imaginative in how we create the space for these investments to come in. Second point, how do we ensure that we have both public and private sector creditors around the table? Yes, it's important to ensure that we have equal treatment, etc. I was at the World Bank in the late 90s, early 2000, part of the HIPC team. And I know how difficult it was to get even the multilaterals on the same page, because there's a variability of approaches. Today, if you compare concessionality, take Chinese the concessionality of Chinese bilateral, compare it with Japanese bilateral, compare it with European bilateral lending to Africa, it varies widely. And so the stakes are pretty high politically, even on the creditor side. And so this issue of how we get not just the private sector being part, but how we have some harmonization, particularly with concessionality. The SSI is great, but it leaves out 16 important African countries. And their access to concessional funding is greatly diminished. And so we have to think about how we do that. Then my last point has to do with innovative financing. We have talked, the paper raises these issues up in terms of how do we have bond offerings? How do we bring new money to the table? But I'd like to add to this, how do we ensure that we enhance the governance of existing resources? Last year, UNCTAD released a report. Illicit financial flows estimated at $89 billion a year from the African continent. We could argue about, quibble about the magnitude, but what we cannot deny is the fact that if we have better governance of the contracting and the management of these natural resources in Africa, in particular, we'll be able to create some of this fiscal and investment space and ensure that the nature of investment that's flowing into the continent is such that we are creating the kind of investment that will ensure not just sustainable, but equitable growth in the outer years and make these economies less vulnerable and more resilient in the future. Well, let me stop here because colleagues have already highlighted a lot of the issues. But once more, I just want to congratulate the authors, excellent piece, and thanks for sharing it. Over to you, George.
Thank you so much, Raymond. Those are excellent comments. We've got about 20 minutes left on the call. What I would like to do is I could turn it over to a couple of people who have made some questions through the chat, and then we could open it up back to the authors so that they can have a chance to both address some of the discussants' comments that we just heard, but also some of the things that are coming up on the chat. Could I ask Lars Jensen to come in with a brief question, please?
Thank you, George. I hope you guys can hear me. First of all, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I would like to maybe try to challenge some of the underlying assumptions of the study and get your opinion on my views. I'll stick to pillar 1 and 2 of your proposal. The first question is, if we accept the premise that a country's debt is unsustainable or the country is insolvent, then giving the country a haircut to restore sustainability is not really going to free up any resources. So how does your proposal aim to deal with that issue if you want countries to use freed up resources for green investments? I mean, if you want to give a haircut that goes beyond sustainability, why not give it as aid instead? And my second question is, would it not be considered as double standards if a group of bilateral creditors who have very high climate and environmental footprints, they start making these kind of demands for countries with very low environmental and climate footprints in order for them to get debt relief? Because I see that this is very different than HIPC, where the focus was on poverty eradication. So those are my 2 questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lars. Maybe I could open it up to Janibek Ibrahim, who made a question about the World Bank. I can read it. The question is, how can we ensure that the World Bank would be interested to issue these bonds? I assume it's the green recovery bonds that are guaranteed or underwritten by a group of IFIs. And a final question from Mark Liberati. Would you like to take the floor? Mark? All right, I'll read the question. It says, instead of GDP growth as the determining measurement and the metrics, would it be considered to have used planetary human development indicators or green HDR index improvements as factors in green relief? And I think this question aims sort of to the broader question of metrics, the metrics we use, usually anchored in GDP per capita for all financial and fiscal issues. And within the UN system, I think we have a very interesting conversation about moving beyond GDP as that agenda. All right, let me pass it over to our co-authors for some responses and from some comments and from the insights that you've heard. Over to you, Shamshad.
Okay, so I think we should reverse the order. We should let Stephany first respond, and then I will come back to some of the points, particularly the premise of the country's debt is unsustainable and others. So Stephany, if you want to step in first on the green recovery bonds?
Okay, that's fine. I mean, just very briefly on the first point, if you have a haircut, that means that the debt service that you pay foreign creditors goes down. That means that you have more domestic resources, and particularly more fiscal space, because here we're talking about public debt. And therefore, you can use those resources. Clearly, the countries have their own priorities, and I don't think we want them to use all the debt relief for the priorities that we think. But I believe that a lot of the things that we're arguing, like more inclusiveness and more green, and I would add more dynamic, coincides with the priorities of most debtor countries. So it's a sort of, if you like, good conditionality. Having been a critic for a long time of bad IMF conditionality. So I think, Shamshad may want to, and Uli may want to elaborate on this, but it does free up resources, and then it's how you distribute it. And I think we argue that part of these resources freed up should go, as I said, to investment in climate change and also in making the economy more equitable. I actually agree a lot with your issue about double standards. I mean, it is a bit strange if you have a creditor who still has coal mines open to tell countries in the South who are very poor to close them and to use the opportunity of debt relief to do that. So I think, but there is again this argument that it may be actually good for the country to go along a renewable path, because it will mean that in the future, they will, for example, be more likely to be able to export products which are produced with green energy than with fossil fuel energy. So it may be also in the country's interest to do that. But I do agree with your point, and also because some of these creditor countries are very large and their impact on emissions are much bigger than, say, a small low-income African country. So we have to be a little bit respectful of their priorities. I mean, more than a little, very respectful. Now, the question about the bonds. I mean, the idea is that for the World Bank or the IDA to issue these bonds, it would clearly have to have the support of the developed countries. So, for example, in the case of Latin America and the Brady bonds, it was basically the US Treasury, because the American banks were heavily exposed in Latin America, that endorsed the issuance of US Treasury bonds. Interestingly, none of these loans defaulted. None of them were called on. So there were no losses. And I think in that sense, it's an interesting precedent that you can issue these bonds that give a sort of, a sort of halo effect to the private creditors, to encourage them to accept lower levels of debt because they have this kind of guarantee. I think you can also use other incentives, like, for example, tax incentives. When do you give the tax relief? When the bank provisions the debt, or when they actually give the debt relief. And if you delay at least part of the tax incentive till they actually give the debt relief, then you're pushing them towards giving more debt relief. This is relevant for the case of banks. So I think you need, you would need some kind of political support for this, for the World Bank to issue such bonds. You would need, the creditor countries to put, their hearts where their mouth is, and commit to do that, which is not easy. But I think that there is no point in just calling on private creditors to do this if you A, don't push them, and B, don't give them incentives.
Okay, let me chip in. First of all, thanks a lot to great comments and also great questions. So first of all, on the question on new spending, or kind of using part of the freed up money for green inclusive recovery investment. Now, obviously the question is, how much money do you free up? So, I mean, as Stephany said, if debt payments are cut back, then less money needs to go into that. But of course, if you are already over indebted and basically don't really have much money, then where to take it from? But ultimately, it's a question of how big is the haircut? And as Shamshad emphasized, one of the principles is that this really has to be about meaningful haircut. So we're not just talking about some marginal haircut. I won't give you a number now, but it has to be substantial. And very importantly, and that also relates to Lars Jensen's second question around double standards. So we say that it's absolutely important that the investments that are needed for climate mitigation are being figured into the debt sustainability analysis. We need to be very clear. Investing in climate adaptation and climate resilience is not some nice thing to do. It is really, for many countries, a matter of survival for many people. Yeah? And it's not just only small island states, but for many, many countries, it really is a matter of life or death of investing in climate resilience. So these are crucial investments they need to undertake. Likewise, in the current circumstances with a terrible pandemic raging, countries need to be put in a position to spend on healthcare. They need to roll out vaccinations and all that. This is not optional spending. This is money that has to be spent, and this has to be figured into the calculations for necessary debt relief. So therefore, I would say, of course, the idea is not to do debt relief and then force countries to spend on all kinds of things that rich countries would like them to do. It's really about freeing resources, putting them in a position, creating fiscal space to undertake absolutely crucial investments. And also, we explicitly say part of the freed up resources. And a very important part of our story is also aligning public policies and budgets with the SDGs. And aligning public budgets with SDGs does not mean that you have to spend more money on green or something. It means that you basically mainstream sustainability considerations in public finances. And now, if we can agree that in principle, with all limitations, the SDGs are desirable, then we do want, of course, and it should be in the self-interest of countries to invest in that. And just one final comment, governance was brought up a number of times. And of course, governance is always an important issue. But in a way, it's also part of the SDGs. So SDG 16, for example, is also about institutions. And but we also need to be clear, with such a debt initiative, we won't be able to fix all problems. I mean, I've heard people saying, well, debt relief is not the solution. In a couple of years, people, these countries are where they were before. And the HIPC initiative is often taken as an example. We've seen debt levels of many countries that participated in the HIPC initiative being now in a really difficult spot again. Yes. So we're not presenting a single silver bullet. It has to be part of a kind of a broader deal, and you need many more things. We need fresh money, SDRs, capital increase for public multilateral development banks, and on. Proper debt restructuring mechanisms on the global level. So we're only talking about kind of part of the solution, but we argue that it has to be an important one. Over to you, Shamshad.
Okay, thank you. I think both yourself and Stephany have covered quite a bit of the ground. Let me make a few points based on the questions that were raised. First of all, nobody likes public debt, in my view. But public debt is needed for capital accumulation, which is absolutely critical for growth. However, what has been happening is that public debt, particularly, I mean, I'm sure we can analyze the historical growth in the global debt particularly of the low-income countries and developing countries and emerging markets. And we will find a lot of problems in that because this debt never went into real investments. A latest study has shown that actually the 2008 crisis, we were able to invest more in green. It was not a huge amount, but in this round, that ratio has gone down. So I think what has happened in the panic that has been created in both the public quarters, and given that coronavirus is health, and health involves human beings, people were thrown off their jobs in middle-income countries. Several bulk of the people were off the thing. So, you know, there was clearly a panic in the quarters where they were effectees, and there was a panic in the multilateral system, in my view. So nobody thought through this in an effective manner, is my view. Because what has happened is that the money that has been brought to the table by way of the debt service suspension, which is a valuable resource, and nobody is saying that it should not have happened. But what unfortunate part that happened was that we have not been able to utilize the DSSI money generated or other type into what I would call to really help us restructure the debt, but also to make sure that we should have invested this money in the development. And as Uli pointed out, we ought to worry about that. I was looking at numbers for my own country. Bulk of the money actually ended up going into unproductive expenditure. So this comes to Luis Lopez's point that, you know, who's guiding all this? You have very low revenue GDP ratios. Latin America is known to have enjoyed the best of the best debt restructuring packages, which taxpayers have paid for, but it keeps on repeating this. So the moral hazard is definitely high. I would be the last person to say a debt restructuring deal should be put together without thinking through this. And first of all, we should use the money that is released from DSSI into productive expenditure. And green is better than just a plain vanilla productive expenditure. So I think we need to tie this up. And I know people don't like conditionalities. They don't work, is absolutely right. But you cannot be giving debt relief to country that has only 9% of GDP ratio tax collection. I'm totally against that. And that's the point that we were making, that in this whole scheme of things, of course, we have made IMF the custodian of figuring out the debt resolution, and the debt resolution will include, of course, IMF and World Bank to sit together and pull all these various elements, because it can't happen. They have to have, I mean, conditionality may be a wrong word, but we need a medium-term economic framework where absolutely countries abide by the enhancement of domestic resource mobilization. And that is not happening in Latin America. That's not happening in South Asia. It's not happening in a number of Asian economies. So we, at least I, as one of the persons responsible for this, will never ask that debt relief be given blanket without requiring countries to come up with, one, a tax GDP ratio increment, because if you don't have that, you can't even sell this debt restructuring plan to anybody, what to talk about the private sector. And to assume that you will have a debt restructuring without own effort is, I think, crazy. But right now, we cannot raise revenues. It's a question of the timing. If we could, because of the severe economic contraction, we have to make sure that growth is regained, and then the collection agencies perform better. The macroeconomic framework today do not hold together. And that is why, if you recall, I actually mentioned that we have to look at interest liabilities. They do absorb about 30 to 70% of revenues. So we have to address that variable absolutely. Then we have to figure out what is short-term and what is the medium-term debt and which one to restructure when. So, you know, as I said, the devil lies in the detail. We have to go through this in a very rigorous manner, and it cannot just be said that, you know, we do this, but even the debt service suspension required massive amount of work that I have come across. So to think that this would be aimlessly done, no. But the debt sustainability analysis instrument is very critical. They need to really uplift the game. And with debt sustainability analysis, you have to have a macroeconomic framework, which only IMF, World Bank partner to pull it together. And once that's there, then we should, it's not a moral hazard. Now, if countries don't comply with the framework, then countries should not be given the money. Sorry, I don't want to be heartless, but that's how it should be. I can tell you in several countries that I have looked at, the money has gone into just unfruitful expenditure. So you have to definitely go in for a haircut, because that will bring in another partner. If you bring in other creditors, you'll bring in fresh money. It's not just going to, but you could use the bilateral money to then finance the haircut. So it's you have to work all the sequence and architecture in an effective manner. I think I've spoken enough on this, but I think there was a question about the GDP versus the HD. I think as it is, GDP is hell of a job to estimate, and I don't think any country estimates the GDP effectively. But I have to tell you, although I think UNDP has an edge on UN Human Index, and I think when I was in United Nations, used to rely on this great work of UNDP that you had indexed. But I have to tell you, if we think GDP is an inadequate index, look at the statistical problems with the human indicators. Labor force has a problem. Women's participation has a problem. Education statistics have a problem. So I don't know what metrics to adopt. That's all I have to say. But you have to really, at the end of the day, look at the risk return of what's going on with the debt relief redeployment. And that is the logic that we have been articulating in terms of the debt relief to be thought out in a systematic manner. And the common framework as presented by G20, my point is it's not an adequate common framework. It hasn't thought through a lot of questions. And least of all, the private creditors are not in the game eventually. It's obviously, you first sort it out with the bilateral creditors and the debtor, then you go to and the bondholders are only consulted towards the end. You have to listen to the markets if you want a haircut. And that, of course, is not going to be easy to just get like that, because I had initially refused. Now they are coming slowly to the table, provided we can back it with certain reforms. Over to you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Akhtar, Professor Griffith-Jones, Professor Volz. I think we've had a fantastic webinar. We look forward to coming back to this discussion in a few months, actually, because a lot of the things you said will be, can be reflected with the test of time. I think this is a moment in which the existing debt architecture is put to the test. And we know that architecture has some holes, some gaps, and some issues. We touched upon many in this case. I think what I would like to just say to wrap this up is that the UN and UNDP in particular, we very much like the ambition of the proposal and the clarity of thinking through the sequencing, the principles, and the link to development outcomes. We're not experts on debt. We're not experts even on fiscal issues, but we are experts on the green transition, on the digital changes, on inclusive transformation on the development side, on the asset side, if you will, of the liability asset discussion. So we're thrilled to have you here. We're going to continue having these webinars over the next few weeks. I wanted to thank all of you for joining us. This is the community of practice of poverty and inequality at UNDP. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Okay, George, let me also thank you for convening this. We are very proud of this partnership with UNDP, which includes all my colleagues. Only 2 are on the screen, but we have Kevin, who's not there. We have Moritz, we have a group of incredible people who are working with them. I'd like to thank them because it's been a great partnership. But I wanted to suggest that we should carry this partnership forward. We will be working on issues of almost all the areas we have talked about, the debt relief, thinking further, the liquidity provisions like issuance of SDR will have an important role to play. Can it finance certain categories or not? We will have to think if the green recovery bonds can be financed through grant assistance, for instance, the haircuts or whatever. So we have to think through a lot of these questions. So we would like to have an engagement on a regular basis with your group that is dealing with. And I can tell you that the debt swap is a piece of work that I think some of us are working with different countries on. We have had an engagement with the Arab Commission. We've had an engagement in terms of discussion with Alicia, who's got this Caribbean proposal, which is waiting for green climate funds, liquidity support, which hasn't come for the last 10 years, as far as I can tell. And then we have had engagement. I've also had engagement with UNSCAP at a private level, but I understand Asia is not buying into the debt swaps. I mean, Asia is filled with liquidity as it is, you know, and there are other partnerships that Asia has. But if we could also work with the UN system at large. I know that UNDP has certain funding sources. We would be very happy to undertake some technical assistance work with you all, because while you see some of us here, there is a whole network that we have with Uli's whole network. There are 4 or 5 institutions that are co-sponsoring this work. One is the Global Policy Development Center. So I think this partnership is very critical for us because you also have climate funds sourced from different avenues. And I can tell you this from my investigation because I'm working on a Pakistan Environment Fund creation. So I found out that some of the GCF funding is with some national agencies out here. So I'd like that we discuss all this because we could think more creatively and work with you and support you, particularly since you have a presence in G20 and so does ACM have. So I'd like to leave with this note that we value this partnership. We will deliver to you more. And we would like to work more closely with you, and this interface will be extremely helpful for our team. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Shamshad. We're delighted and thrilled, and we also see this as a wonderful partnership, as you've seen from the reactions from our colleagues on this call. I'm sure that we've got a roadmap ahead of us. So let's take this offline, and we'll get back to you on more specifics of how we can move on many fronts. But thank you again for this particular webinar. We're delighted.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
All the best. Bye.